How do you build momentum for project-based learning with your staff so that it's not a top-down initiative? How do you invite other teachers to join you as you trailblaze PBL at your school? A book study is a great next step invitation to learn more about PBL. PBL Simplified the book will hit bookshelves across the country on January 17th. You can pre-order your copy today at Barnes & Noble or Amazon. After you pre-order your copy of PBL Simplified, go to the link in the show notes of this episode to download a free copy of the book study. The book study takes you and your team through the 6 steps of project-based learning. Each chapter has a set of online resources to help you and your team start building PBL while you're learning together. There's 2 chapters specifically around implementation and leadership. Pre-order your copy of PBL Simplified today. Are your teachers fighting apathy in their classrooms? Do you have teachers that are burned out or leaving your school? Are you looking for your passion for the work? Having trouble finding it? If you answered yes to any of these questions, then you're in the right place. I'm Ryan Stoyer, and this is the PBL Simplified podcast, dedicated to equipping you to be a visionary leader who's committed to self-development, collaboration, and changing education. You were made for a time such as this, and I'm here to guide you down the path to fulfill your vision. Welcome, visionary leader. Whether you're a visionary leader at a district, building, or classroom, you are in the right place. And on the second Wednesday of the month, which is this episode, we interview a teacher in the classroom and do a deep dive into one of their PBL units. We call it a PBL Showcase. I think you're going to really enjoy this main episode. Before we do that, we're going to have a need to know around math and PBL and how it equals creativity. And really a quarter twist on that, on how all content areas need creativity for great PBL. We're going to do a leadership leap around the Mastermind book by Danny Bauer and his Ruckus Makers. In our full episode, the PBL Showcase, we are going to hear from Kristina, a high school math teacher, and how she creatively brings in authentic opportunities for her learners, even in her higher level math courses. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Looking to start your own podcast and not sure where to start? Use the same podcasting service I use to edit, post, and market my podcast episodes. 5 Talents Podcasting will take your raw audio and present it to the world. All you have to do is record. We've actually worked out in a package where you can coach with me while you grow your following or your business. Go to 5talentspodcasting.com to get started today. You may have clicked on this podcast episode to hear about PBL and math. So why does the quote to start us out talk about creativity? Isn't creativity in language arts or arts class? No, creativity is in every class, especially math. You've got to find some creative ways to connect your standards to the real world. That's our need to know today. How do we connect my standards to the real world? And I say my standards because I get this question from all subject areas. The social studies teacher that says, we're studying ancient Chinese dynasties. How does that relate to the real world? Well, let's do some creative thinking and figure out what was most important in those standards. What do you want kids to learn? The big picture learning, sometimes called the essential question, the big theme, and how can that relate to the real world? How can that be your connection point? I've had the same conversation with language arts teachers, with science teachers. Yet you have the scientific method, but as you're doing experiments, they still need to circle back to the real world of your learners. Even in CTE class, you might be doing real-world work. You're doing oil changes. But as you're doing that, or you're taking apart a machine, or you're doing graphic design, you've got to think about your end user and the real-world applicability of that for your user and for your learner. So there's creativity built into project-based learning, which I think is one of the reasons I love it so much, because it looks so different in different local communities, whether it's rural, suburban, urban, whether it's the northeast part of the country or the southwest part of the country, wherever you're at, your PBL is going to look a little different. Now we want it to be steeped in authenticity, so your learners are doing real-world work, and they're super engaged, and they're learning rigorous standards-based work, but it looks a little bit different. And that's okay. In fact, that's good. It probably means you're doing it well, right? That's why we don't have a big bank of projects for you to go and do. Because if you pick one up from the Northeast and you're in the Southwest, it might not make sense to your learners. you're the expert. Your creativity, which sometimes we don't always tap on in the classroom. We don't always say, hey, how would you do this? Sometimes you're just given a curriculum and you say, go. So leaders, as you're listening to this, you need to give your staff some time to be creative. How would you connect these standards to the real world? And teachers, once you're empowered to do that, you're going to love the way PBL resonates with your learners. So creativity and PBL go hand in hand. Peanut butter and jelly, right? You got to connect them. And you're going to hear that today in our main episode with Kristina as we look at PBL and math. She's going to really talk to us about the creativity that needs to happen. So I think it'll be a great lesson that'll continue answering this need to know for us. Our leadership leap today is around the book Mastermind by Danny Bauer. Now, Danny Bauer is an expert in masterminds and education. If you've never been a part of a mastermind, it is a life-changing experience. I'm in a mastermind. That's why I like to talk about them. I also talk about coaching because I have a coach and I do coaching. And we'll probably start some coaching at Magnify Learning in the summer, but right now we don't have it. So I have no problem recommending Danny Bauer to you. In fact, he is the man. Better Leaders, Better Schools is his website and his podcast. I highly recommend that you go subscribe. If you're listening to this podcast, you've probably got about 8 podcasts in your library or so. I'd make room for Danny. Him and his ruckus makers are changing education for the positive, and they're doing it in a way that's sustainable for your leadership. So I highly recommend his book, Mastermind. Go out there wherever you buy books and grab a copy today, because a mastermind is going to be you and 10 to 20 leaders just like you that are going to meet weekly, maybe bi-weekly, and talk about life and talk about the real struggles that you have in a building. Because let's be honest, most people don't understand what happens in a school building. They don't understand their principal may have 35, 40 direct reports, all of them from a highly degreed teacher to the custodian that's going to open the door. They all report to her. So there aren't a whole lot of people you can go to in the business world or in the nonprofit world even to say, hey, how does this work for you? So you need other people in your network, and a close mastermind is a great way to do it. You stay connected with these people. They're invested in you. You invest in them. And that's where some of my best learning happens. That's where my ideas are stretched. That's where people can say, yeah, I see that, Ryan, but are you playing it safe? I don't get that every day, right? Like sometimes I'll put an idea out there and it's just this small flame and they pour gasoline on it and it's just it's this huge idea now. But they're also there to help me bring it to fruition. They're there to help me with the logistics that might need to happen, with asking me good questions to make sure I've thought 360 degrees around this idea before I present it to anyone. So I highly recommend Masterminds. I think Danny's book, Masterminds, is a great place to start. You can find a link in the show notes to grab that one. Today's main episode is a PBL Showcase, and we're going to be talking about PBL and math. What does project-based learning look like in a higher-level math course? Kristina is going to guide us through that and her process, and again, creativity is a strand that will weave through the episode, and she gets into specifics. And she takes something that might be boring, like data, but data with context becomes exciting and becomes real world, and then can be used to do good work in that world. So I hope you enjoy this episode. All right, PBL Simplified audience, this is the first PBL Showcase of 2023, so super excited about that. And we bring these to you because we want you to know that great PBL is happening around the country from real teachers and real schools with real students. This is not all theoretical, right? These are things happening for real. So today we've got Kristina Werner from Florida, and she's with us, and she's going to tell us a little bit about our PBL unit. Kristina, thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. So we like to start really every podcast guest episode, whether it's a showcase or a leadership guest episode, with what is your why as an educator? So why are you in education?
That's a great question. I grew up with parents who love to learn, and they really instilled that love of learning. And I just love school. I just love to go to school. I was one of those kids that when I was sick, I would panic because I wanted to be in school, and my parents would have to make me stay home when I was sick. And It's funny because when I was in high school, my teachers like, don't be a teacher, don't be a teacher. And I went to college and I was just floundering because I wanted direction. And I remember my mom sitting me down and saying, Kristina, you know what you want to do. You should be a teacher. And so I became a teacher, and because I love learning. And I think over the years, my why has kind of grown and evolved. And based off of my experiences in the different schools I've taught at, and I taught for several years in California, and my why really became about equity in mathematics and trying to make sure more students were could see themselves as math learners. And once I had an opportunity to work at a PBL school in Florida, that even expanded more, trying to engage more students in math and see themselves in a math classroom and in a math community, but also enabling them to see that they actually can use math and there are connections outside of just problems from a book. And so PBL has really lent itself to creativity for me as an educator, but also bringing in more kids that typically haven't found as much success in the math classroom. And so that's really exciting because it really connects with my quest for making sure more students can be successful in a math classroom.
Yeah, that's so awesome. And this is actually why we share our whys in the podcast or in trainings, whatever it is, because in your answer, Kristina, and I know the audience is resonating with this, like teaching is a calling, right? Like there's just more to it. It's not just, hey, I picked a major, right? It's this thing that's just been with you. And in your experience, like if you're not picking the right major, it's like, well, teaching's waiting for you, right? I'm waiting for you to pick me because that's where you belong, right? Like how fun is that?
Yep, for sure.
And we were talking off air a little bit because, Kristina had kind of a weird day yesterday, right? And it's like, well, what's a weird day in education? And right now, listener, you're thinking of all the weird things that have happened to you, right? And it's just so different than any other genre or career. Like weird things happened to me when I was an engineer, but it was never, the extent of like two kids were making out in the cabinet, right? The big cabinets, right? Or like, Jim brought what to school? Like it's just those things. So Kristina, I love that you're there for your learners on weird days too, right?
Yeah. And they're there for me on off days too. Like I'm forever amazed and surprised at their compassion and their ability to kind of bring me back to the moment when I'm having a rough time too. So we're kind of there for each other, which is beautiful and wonderful.
Yeah, that is. And you guys have a great culture at your school. But hey, this is our PBL Showcase where we look at one PBL unit and we kind of do a deep dive into it and give people a feel for what your PBL unit is like so they can kind of get some ideas. They can bounce off of that. I love that you mentioned creativity coming to your standards and your math work. So why don't you give us a little bit of an overview of your PBL unit?
Yeah, so there's so much data in the world around us. We have access to data free online. And so I wanted my students to learn, we were learning about linear equations, slope, y-intercept. And the class that this was in is a senior level class, mostly senior level class of students who didn't want to take EP calculus or weren't quite, had maybe already taken pre-calc, or some of them that didn't want to take pre-calc. So it's kind of a mixed bag of students that for whatever reason, just wanted to have this class that would help them get ready for college level algebra to make sure they could be successful. And so we were learning about lines, and it's not a great title of a project, but it's the World Hunger Line of Best Fit project. And so they were basically tasked to look up some data, and I gave them some websites that they could look at of daily calories, life expectancy, and infant mortality rates. And so what they did is we talked about what things we should compare. And so they made two different graphs, one comparing daily calorie intake and life expectancy, and daily calorie intake and infant mortality. And basically they were charged with figuring out a linear model. And they had to find slope, and they had to find y-intercept, and they had to explain what slope and y-intercept meant. And so that was kind of the math, right? Because I'm always like, when I'm thinking about teaching math, like I have to get to math standards because math is so important. There's so many tests that they have to take. But the community, so my driving question was, how do we as data analysts analyze and create linear models that model world hunger and life expectancy data so that we know how to advocate for better food policies around the world? So I kind of brought in this idea of wanting to look at what food policies were potentially causing hunger, or what food policies they could enact, or even what food policies were, how food policy is written. Because a lot of, I explore a lot about different areas of equity, and food equity is one of those things. And there's enough food in the world. We just aren't great at making sure the everyone has access to it. And so I contacted, I've struggled for years. And part of the problem is our school started 4 years ago, right before COVID hit. And so we've had, most of this has been, okay, we're gaining traction. Oh, now there's a pandemic, or oh, now there's a hurricane, right? So there's been a lot of interruption in our school, and interruption in projects. And so community partners has been like one of my struggles as a math facilitator. And so I just reached out to our regional director at Bread for the World, which is it's a faith-based organization that advocates for food policy. It's been around since 1982. And I just happened to just reach out to the director, and one of the regional directors, and say, hey, would you be willing to talk to my math class just about how food policy is made? Because that's not an area of expertise for me. And because I wanted the kids to like be familiar with the data, familiar enough to know that there's a problem, right? Because if you don't know there's a problem, you don't even know what questions to ask. And so I wanted them to be familiar with that. And Florence French-Fagan said, yes, I'll do this. The great thing is that there is the Global Food Security Act that is up for reauthorization. So your students could write their policymakers, they could write their House of representatives, they could write their senators. And so it grew much bigger than what I thought it would. So we used data, and she came in and talked to the students about how to contact the representatives, how to find the representatives, the best way to advocate for like different policies. It was a really exciting and amazing project.
That is exciting. I like the idea of just reaching out, right? Like you just reached out to somebody, and it would be easy to talk yourself out of it, probably, right? Like that person's too busy. I don't have a close contact with them. I don't have a warm relationship, but your project is right in line with their work, right? So yeah. It's a call that they would want to take, right? Or a contact they would want to take. And obviously they jumped right in.
Sure. And I think it was interesting because I kept trying. I tried the year before when I was teaching Algebra 2, I went to an ice cream shop. I thought it'd be a great community partner. I went and I asked, and they never got back to me. It was kind of like a silent no. I didn't have time to keep going back and back and back. And so I was just desperate. I was like, I'm just going to email everybody I can think of, and just kept trying. And she responded. And I wonder, and I don't know the answer to this, but the two community partners I've gotten this year are both from nonprofits who kind of have that education part to it. So I kind of have that wonder, like if they're already are a nonprofit and that's what their job is, to explain and advocate, maybe that's a place where I need to start looking more. I don't know.
No, I think you're right. I'd +1 that. I think that's a gold mine. When I help people brainstorm possible community partners, that is a full area that I put to the side as nonprofits, because those executive directors of nonprofits, they're passionate about their area of expertise. Right. Outreach and advocacy is typically part of their job, and they have some flexibility in their schedule, right, to come in, right? They're not, an engineer that's expected to be there from 8 to 8 sometimes, but right. So they have the flexibility to go out in the community to do outreach. So when you look at nonprofits as a possibility for a community partner, I do think it's a rich area to go into.
Yeah.
So I like that, we're in math, and I'm trying not to geek out and tell our listeners like, hey, you can do PBL in math, obviously, yeah. Right? And I like that you're bringing creativity into math to find some of these answers. So now you've got your learners looking at data, which is typically kind of a dry subject, right? But incredibly important, right? I just think about Magnify Learning, all the data that we punch in, whether it's reflection notes from past trainings or SEO and like Google data, data is everywhere. The ability to crunch that and make good decisions, right, is so important. So you've got them looking at what should they compare as far as the data, but now they're also going to apply it, right? So what did that side of things look like? Like once they figure out how to advocate, what did that part of the project look like?
Yeah, so I wanted them to, I didn't make them write a letter to the policymaker because I just didn't want to say, you have to do this. It just felt weird to me. But I did make them write a sample letter. And then we did take some time in class and we went to our representatives, our our senators are Marco Rubio and Rick Scott. And we pulled up the website and I'm like, okay, we can click on email. And when you do that, you want to put in like the SB6, whatever the number is in the heading. And these are all things I didn't know. This was not taught to me how to like write to my Congress people, or even like how to go about making sure that it actually got their attention. And so the part where they actually reached out is we spent some time in class making sure that they had time once I had read the letter and gave them some feedback on any grammatical mistakes and making sure that it made sense and they felt good about it. They had some time in class if they wished to send the letter on, that they could. But part of the project, once they looked at the data, they had a better understanding that it was even a problem and why people even cared about it. Because what was interesting is some students were like, I didn't know world hunger was even a problem. And that kind of blew my mind because, there are hunger people in our country and we need to advocate for definitely better food policy in our country. But it was just kind of mind boggling to me that they just had no idea because they have access to so much information. But then I realized some of their information is so like focused on what, the algorithms and everything. It's not going to come up unless somebody else brings it up to them. And, our math classroom is a perfect place to look at the different data to kind of open their eyes to there are these problems or these other like situations that are happening out in the world that we should be paying attention to and thinking outside of the box of how we can solve these problems.
Yeah, and I think that's spot on, Kristina. So I love that you brought that to your learners. Like they still have some voice and choice in your classroom. Obviously, that's part of your culture. But sometimes our newer PBLers will be like, well, I thought the kids had to lead the whole thing and pick the project and pick the ideas. But I think it's also part of our job to help them understand what it is they care about and what they're passionate about. And sometimes they just don't know, right? So we can bring this and somebody might be like, wow, this is a big deal. How come there are food pantries in this part of the city and not this part of the city, right? And I didn't know these things happened around the world, but I'm passionate about that. And now they actually know how to write to their senator, right? And you and I didn't. I probably don't know the right way to do it either. But they get to figure that out at 16, 17, 18, right? So that's so neat, kind of the foundation that you're setting for them and the real world piece. Did you have some learners that sent those off?
They did. They sent them off. I don't think they got a direct response. So the bill has actually, I was hoping to actually be able to go to the representative the House of Representative who is for our school area, but then we had Hurricane Ian come in and then they passed it before we could even get to get that ball rolling and make an appointment and all of that. Because I really wanted them to have an experience of the most effective way to talk with someone. Because I just thought that would be really great. Because Florence, our community partner was like, you need to have an agenda and you need to have be very organized when you go in and you talk to the policymaker. They want to know that this is professional and that you're ready. Because I just wanted them to have that experience. And our principal was very on board with it. She was completely fine. But then we had a natural disaster come through. And so right in the middle of our project. And so we kind of had to shift gears and kind of change a little bit. So the legislation has passed the House. It has not, as I just checked yesterday, it hadn't passed Congress yet. And so it might be something that I remind them and be like, hey, if you want to call or you want to email, you can keep emailing. This is something that you can keep. If they see enough people concerned about this, then they will pay attention and do something about it.
Well, and I like the heart and the professional or employability skill, right, of being able to go to a professional office, have an agenda, speak your mind, be able to say those things in a way that people will listen, right? If you just go in there and start yelling about food insecurity and food policy, nobody hears you, but they could hear you, right? And there's a protocol to that, and helping our learners understand that, I think it's a big deal for their future outcomes.
Yeah, and another thing that I really liked about this particular, I think, politics is such a hard place right now, but it was bipartisan, and they're very intentional about trying to make sure that, and I wanted the students to see that, there are instances in our government in which people are joining together to make the world a better place. And I wanted them to kind of see that and be a part of it. I thought that was also a really important aspect that I wanted them to kind of be able to focus on.
Yeah, they probably don't get to see that a lot either.
Yeah.
One piece where I might interject a bit, and sometimes there are some barriers to this, but once you're in math and you've got them writing letters, it's a great invitation to the English language arts teacher, right? To say, hey, I need somebody to write this letter, and it's likely in their standards, right? And now they have content, they have a reason, they have some authenticity. So as a language arts teacher, like, I would jump at that chance. Did you reach out to a language arts teacher, or like, I know there's some structural things that get in the way sometimes, but
Yes.
I wonder if that enters into, maybe your next project, if you can find a way to do that.
For sure. And I even thought about our government teacher, about how laws get enacted, right? Like, because you could actually watch this, I feel like there's just so many places, and that would be definitely an area in which I'd want to improve, is just to definitely reach out to English teachers and the government teacher, or US, history, some place where they're actually like, could see this go step by step and see all the different ways that the different disciplines, having math knowledge, you understand why this is important, right? You can see the data, it makes more sense. Reading these articles like connect, because you've actually looked at the numbers, right? And it makes more sense what infant mortality is, and what, and what this 3.4% means, versus just randomly reading that. If you've done the math behind it, it makes a little bit more sense. And then having them put that all together in a letter, with the personal connections and the things that they would be able to express their ideas well. I think that would be such a great way to improve this PBL, for sure.
Yeah, great. And you just hit my question that I normally ask. So you nailed that. Like, what would you want to improve? I would love to see one of your learners, in the office of, a government official, talking about, well, the World Economic Forums has this data, and if you look at this, right, so here's what I recommend. Like, I could just see like a jaw dropping, right? And what a great experience for your learners. So I love that they've got the real world applicability of, sending these letters or sending a note in. But maybe next time it is that next step, right? Of they get their shirt and tie on, or they get their suit on, and they get to head in. And what a great experience for your learners.
Yeah.
Kristina, can you talk about, because you've got the podcast mic right now, right? So as a math teacher, right, in high school, you're in higher level math courses, like, what is project-based learning, what's it doing for your classroom? Because sometimes we hear that, hey, it's a little too hard, I'm not sure I can do that. Like, but what's it look like for you?
Well, I think, gosh, I love being creative in math. And I think for me, just personally, as a person, it's hard for me to think about teaching math in a traditional sense, in which I'm in a lecture and you're going to practice these problems, and it's always going to look like this, and it's always going to be this way. I'm not wired that way. And it has largely to do with my background. And where I first started teaching in California. And then so PBL it was not a PBL school, but it very much lends itself to how I began my teaching career. So, I think that I want the student being able to have people in my classroom allows them to ask questions. It allows them to make connections that in a normal, regular traditional classroom, they may not feel the freedom to ask or even try to make the connection, right? Because it's not the way the procedure was taught, or whatever the case may be. And I will say it's a challenge to find projects that fit, and that's going to teach them enough math, right? Because obviously we have to get to standards, and there's a lot of standards in math, to be honest, and a lot of skills. So math is a very skills-based class. And so even like currently in my same class that this project was for, we're doing a problem-based learning. So we're still going through kind of the structures of project-based learning, and they're doing linear programming, which is inequalities. But they were each given a different type of problem, and it was like a pretend letter saying, I want you to optimize the solution. These are my constraints. And so they're going through the process of, knows and need to knows, and they're going through the process of having benchmarks and scaffolding before the benchmarks to ensure that they know that they have the skills so that they can actually answer the question. And so those get weaved in every once in a while. But I mean, ultimately, those protocols and things like that still keep coming up within the classroom on a like a day-to-day basis, so that they feel like they have voice and choice, right? And so they feel like they can ask questions and they can get better, and that it's a safe community in which they can make mistakes and then learn from those mistakes. And my goal, I try to have at least some sort of problem-based or project-based project every 9 weeks. And that's just my personal goal that I set out when I started. And if we can get in more smaller ones, then I think that's great. But I'm always, if I find something, I run with it, right? But if it's going to be too difficult, not too difficult for me, but I can't quite make it authentic enough for them, then I scrap it and I just go with, okay, we're going to learn quadratic formula. There's no other way to do this other than you're going to take notes and you have to do these steps, because that is it. Now, can you apply the quadratic formula other places? Yes, that's not maybe the best example, but you know what I mean? Like, there's certain things that this is just how it has to be taught. There's no other way around it.
I think it's a good message, Kristina, for math teachers and leaders and principals that are listening, is it doesn't have to be perfect. I love that you're continually seeking authenticity. And because your learners know that when you can find the authentic connection, you're making it. Sometimes there isn't. So it's like, guys, we got to do this. I said, okay. And they know next time as you can make that connection, you will. They know that you're making that effort to make that connection for them. So it's not that there isn't a connection. You just didn't have it for that one, and that's okay. Right.
And I think they appreciate that too. Cause I'm very honest and like straightforward. I was like, because they know when you're being authentic with them, they see right through that very quickly. And so I think my students really appreciate it, and they get it. They're like, oh, okay, that's fine. We'll just do it this way today. And they're fine.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's so good. That's a good message. Well, Kristina, thank you for sharing your PBL unit with us. I really appreciate your time today.
Yes. Thank you for having me. It was fun.
Absolutely. Well, PBL Simplified audience, thank you so much for tuning in today. This is your first PBL showcase of the new year. Next episode will be a leadership episode again. But you heard today some high-level, applicable PBL work happening in higher math, and the authenticity is there, but also the growth mindset of, hey, start here and continue to get better and work more and more for your students towards that authenticity to build those employability skills. And as you do that, you'll engage your learners, you'll tackle boredom, and you'll transform your classroom. Thank you for listening to this episode of the PBL Simplified podcast. Would you help us achieve our vision of 51 by 2051? One small step you can take to help us out is to leave a review of the PBL Simplified podcast. Scroll down to the bottom of our show page, select a star rating, and leave a review. Your review helps others find this podcast. When you leave a review, the next visionary leader will see your words and join us. Thank you for leading inspired.